Hello, and welcome back to the channel. In this video, I'm going to show you how I took an old piece of driftwood and turned it into a diorama, featuring a banjo playing frog that I hand sculpted and am pretty proud of. Let's get into it. Air plants used to be nestled in these grooves, but I'll be repurposing them for tree branches. The scene I've had in my mind involves a nice bench-shaped piece of wood that the main character sits on top of. After messing with different orientations, I landed on this layout as it nicely sits up against the main form of the driftwood. After attaching these to a base to make for easier working conditions, I needed to go to the drawing board. Originally, I was going to create a hammock and living quarters in the canopy above. However, I'm trying to work on my compositions for these dioramas, and splitting the focal point between two places for such a big piece of driftwood felt too sectionalized. Filling the tree with branches and leaves not only showcases the driftwood, but makes our frog feel more integrated in the scene. So began the process of adding branches. I knew I wanted vines right above his head, so I drilled into the driftwood so I could hang more accordingly. Hot glue served as a temporary hold for the branches. Then by adding epoxy putty after, it kept them in place while also serving as a malleable material that I could work with tools to create a seamless transition. I imprinted deep divots to match the thicker grooves, then smoothed it all out with a silicone sculpting tool. For the more intricate detail, metal sculpting tools worked perfectly. There's something extremely enjoyable about following the grooves from the wood through the putty, trying to make it a believable tree formation. I can imagine it's how the designers of those cell phone reception tower trees feel when trying to match to the local ecology. For greenery, I had an old Woodland Scenics tree building kit that matched the scale I was after. Using some fast and clear drying superglue, I began creating the tree canopy. Using tweezers with superglue to attach tiny little twigs is so much fun. The goal was to make sure the whole thing had excellent coverage. I think I'm just making a cell phone tower at this point. Just like the color matching I did with the epoxy putty, I applied acrylic paint to the newly attached twigs. Diorama Presepe's miniature green climbing ivy are my favorite little touch as far as the tree goes. Sometimes less is in fact more, but I feel like when making a bayou banjo scene, breaking the rules with vines and ivy is an absolute exception. With a foam-safe superglue, I attached a piece of wood to the bottom of the piece. After adding slight variation to the top of the foam with a torch, and of course proper ventilation and the use of a respirator, tape was attached to the sides of the piece to hold a plaster mix. I also added some plaster boulders while the mix was still wet, as well as placed the tree where it would eventually live. The tape was removed once the plaster mix had finished drying, and then rocks and sand were added and sealed in with isopropyl alcohol and watered down PVA glue. This complexity to the riverbed would create some serious issues for me down the line, but we'll get to that later. After dry brushing and airbrushing the base, I got it to a color that I was happy with. I placed some sticks down, glued them in place, then applied a saturated green color on top to simulate moss growth. I pulled that saturation back slightly with another light overbrushing of gray. Some of the pebbles and smaller rocks also got some gray just to give more contrast to the base. I seeded and sealed the driftwood down with UV resin and used those same methods covered earlier in the video to hide the screw which was holding the bench in place. After a couple of accurate scores with my Olfa knife, the polycarbonate sheets were ready to be constructed. I used a 24-hour drying silicone sealant and attached them to the diorama, then formed a bead on every corner and edge. A final color match, then it was time to mix and pour the resin. After degassing it, I poured it all in. Covering it with styrene was a huge mistake though. I wanted to protect the resin from falling leaves and foam from above, but didn't realize it was probably the main contributor to a heat-induced reaction due to the lack of airflow. Lesson learned. I have been watching a lot of sculpting tutorials, mainly Ace of Clay and South of the Border. My frog skeleton might not be reflective of those hours watched, but I'm confident in saying that the finished sculpt would have not turned out nearly as good if I had just winged it. I used Super Sculpey air dry clay for this red-eyed tree frog, as well as bacon bond to stick limbs to the armature wire, and clay softener to blend forms together. I popped little spheres of clay on top of his head, then used this fancy schmancy eye socket tool to make eye sockets. I put slightly smaller spheres of clay in those eye sockets, then gave him a big smile. He's stoked because he's playing the banjo under a tree, and his condescending manager at the lily pad dealership cannot take that from him. He lives for this. Speaking of banjo, I made a small banjo out of a coconut water bottle cap. I filled it with milliput epoxy putty, added some styrene cuts to the sides, which I eventually removed, then wet a sculpting tool to add relief. With a razor blade, I cut a small square hole in the side of it so the balsa wood fingerboard could more easily slot inside. I made this after I had already baked the frog's head and torso in the oven. I normally try to organize my videos in sections of a piece, but I had to go back and forth on the frog and the banjo, as I needed to ensure the banjo, arms, and legs could all fit after the final bake. I added arms, rolled them into slight segments because I thought it looked more interesting, and used the sculpting tool to give the final texture. I moved on to the supporting leg, then the riffing leg. Back to the banjo. I used little pins for the tuning pegs, and a broken pin stem to attach to the headstock to the fingerboard. A little coat of paint, and it was time to head back to the feet and hands. I tried my best at texturing the feet and hands more, like adding webbing and whatnot, but I was finding it very challenging, even though the scale was pretty big. The bacon bond and clay softener are products I am so happy I picked up before attempting this. I essentially never stopped using them. I had to scrape them off of the hobby mat, which was tremendously nerve-wracking after all that footwork we worked on. More softening, more texturing, more building up supporting forms. Finally, I confirmed that the banjo would fit after his final bake, so into the oven he went. Originally, this red-eyed tree frog was going to be fishing in this diorama, but my incredibly talented friend Nick Diehl offered to write and record a little song for this video, which will be played during the final reveal and outro, and that was all I needed to hear to replace the fishing rod with a banjo. For those of you who may be excited for a fishing diorama, fear not, for I do have a complicated relationship with resin at this point, and it just so happens that fishing scenes and resin go together like PB&J, and I still very much want to make fishing dioramas. After I had a good base layer of paint covering the entire sculpt, I applied a wash. Once that dried, I painted the eyes with black slits and started adding highlights on the tops of the arms, muscles, edges, everywhere it makes sense. I added 2 white reflective dots to each eye and gave him a shiny UV resin treatment to make them look glossy and lifelike. The banjo relief got black paint, and I struggled for 45 minutes straight setting real guitar strings on the banjo. Not literally, of course, just gluing them. Here you can see the reacted resin. I was pretty devastated at first, but my partner, as well as the fine crafting community over on Boyle Hobby Time's Discord, shared some kind and supportive words, ultimately convincing me to move on through the speed bumps of the project and to persevere. I trimmed the edges with a sharp blade, then sprayed the sides of the diorama with a gloss varnish. I brushed on some Woodland Scenics water ripples, and once it dried, cut and glued some thin wooden framing. Once that was done, my quest was complete. Here are the final shots of the diorama. Well, there you have it. There's my most recent diorama and submission for Boiler Hobby Time's newest crafting challenge. I'm really happy with how it came out. I'm ecstatic that I got the frog pose to be just how I wanted it in my mind. I'm so happy about that. Other things I've learned, maybe pull back on resin. Maybe the volume is a little too expensive for me not knowing entirely what I'm doing. I think I might be going a little smaller on projects besides the Stardew stuff back there. I'm kind of committed to that. If you're enjoying watching me struggle through learning how to work with resin, the best way to do that would be to like and subscribe on the channel. Ringing the bell gets you notified whenever I post a new video. Besides that, I really appreciate you making it this far in the video, and I'll see you next time.